All right, morning everybody. So I'm Joey Johnson. I'm the one with the long hair. Pretty easy to figure out. We're gonna keep it pretty light, I think the panel was yesterday. So hopefully we'll get a lot of participation. Larry Whiteside is not here, so if somebody else feels really strongly about something that I say, you can just jump up on stage and pretend to be Larry. But obviously Alex and Lewis are here, so guys, come on up, and we will get it rolling. Sir, how's it going? Have a seat.
Good to see you.
All right. I'll let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves so everybody knows who you are.
So, hi, I'm Brodnax. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Greensky.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Bohrani. I'm a former Chief Information Security Officer at Web.com. Just exited recently due to private equity purchase, transition phase.
All right.
Cool. So what we wanted to do today, guys, was when we got together and talked about what we wanted to get into for the panel, you know, obviously everybody here has got a lot of experience in this room, has been doing this all for a long time, and we just kind of said, you know, let's just talk about some emergent things that are actually happening that we're all kind of navigating through. This is not going to be a heavily technical talk. Hopefully we get some debate and some dissenting opinions going. But I think when we spent our time on the prep call, we were like, all right, we got about 4 hours of content if we really wanted to get through it all. So, you know, we'll go ahead and get started. I think one of the things that were kind of the themes that came out was we said, you know, there's obviously a lot of hype, a lot of buzz going on, but I think a lot of organizations are all pretty much going through very similar transformations right now. You know, you keep hearing everybody call it like somebody's version of a digital transformation. What does that mean, and like what are the themes that are really coming out? And I think when I've talked to colleagues, and I think you guys were sharing the same in our prep call, a lot of organizations are obviously in some version of, I used to say migration to the cloud. Almost everybody's there, almost wholly now, and really the decision of, you know, how much are we even staying on-prem at this point, and what does that even mean? And then also, you know, we're hearing buzzwords like zero trust. We're seeing a lot of growth around IAM programs and identity, but I think there's deeper questions about what does identity even mean today. We're seeing a lot of organizations having to work way more collaboratively with external parties. So where we used to have a lot of control over everything, that world is changing. There's a whole lot of data where we used to own it as organizations, and now that is data that's being generated by end users, and the lines are getting very blurry between corporate versus personal. So I think we're going to dive into some of that today. And yeah, like I said, I encourage the audience, if you guys have questions, the lights are not so bright that I can't see hands go up, so please put your hands up and participate. So gentlemen, we'll go ahead and get started. Talk with me for a little bit about like where you guys are and kind of your journey to the cloud and what that's meant for you guys, just briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So Greensky at this point is what we would consider a cloud native company. So we're using the full boat of services in Amazon, not just infrastructure as a service, but platform as a service, some of their software as a service offerings. 4 years ago, literally the week before I started, the company migrated into the cloud, and they did a sort of burn the ships thing where they said, that's it, we've moved, we're here, we're never going back to the on-prem stuff. And anybody who was there at that time refers to that as the summer of 2015. And if you say that, you have to buy the guy a drink, because we all have PTSD from that. And so the thing is, you think of it as somebody else's computer, right? So it's like, look, I'm here and I'm just going to put it there, and now it's someone else's computer. But the reality is there's a whole bunch of these like subtle implications that go along with moving to the cloud. Not just security, but networking and infrastructure, and people are not doing a great job of considering all those things. And so for us, it was a long road to get to a place that was stable, secure, demonstrably secure. And there's a lot of good frameworks and things that are out there now, the Cloud Security Alliance and those sorts of things. But a lot of that stuff was sort of in development at the time. So that's where we are now.
Okay.
The web transition was quite interesting. As I transitioned from the federal government to go to a publicly traded company, I was anticipating a significant amount of modernization, especially for a company such as Web.com, who has been doing PaaS type services, web hosting, before the term PaaS even became prevalent. However, they were still really heavily focused on on their environment being localized, traditional perimeter type setting, 40 offices across the world, data centers, just traditional network architecture. And the transition from a security perspective came in, and we actually have an opportunity here to help modernize this company. And the business was starting to adapt and bring on additional SaaS services, which they wanted to integrate with their existing on-prem Active Directory instance. And knowing the instances of how hackers generally operate, that is one of the worst decisions any CISO could possibly make. And in case you do have Active Directory on-prem and you decide to use ADFS to then integrate it to the rest of the SaaS services out there, I would immediately advise you not to do something like that. If you didn't notice, Citrix just recently got compromised because that's exactly what they did. And so we had to come up with an entire new strategy of how do I actually get all the employees in the company brought into a modern identity management framework, get their, be able to fulfill a lot of the various types of requirements we have to adhere to, including HIPAA and PCI DSS and the SOX and all the various other regulatory requirements that are out there, and really help propel the company because we're going through a significant amount of mergers and acquisitions on an annual basis. And how do we actually bring them into the fold as well in a quickly viable fashion, all while having to still deal with migrating to AWS and Azure at the same time. And that just took a pretty good amount of time and to think about all the various issues and come up with a comprehensive strategy. I think we're going to go talk a little bit into it. And for me, that strategy ended up becoming the Zero Trust Initiative. And we started implementing that and made significant progress in migrating to a Zero Trust framework.
Awesome. So, I mean, I think we'll definitely get into Zero Trust. And you hit on some great points about identity and the convergence with what you have to wrestle with around compliance mandates. But before we get into that, one of the things you said that I think is interesting, and we went through this, and I'm sure you guys probably did as well, is as you have, I've always kind of said, one thing with IT is that a lot of times we're not generating our own demand, right? It is, we are trying to do what the business is asking us to do and help them get there. And they have sometimes very, very different ideas of how quickly we should be able to do that for them. One of the things that we found that was so interesting is as we made the migrations, as we went from various on-prem services to putting things out on SaaS platforms, infrastructure as a service platforms, was the constant sort of dialogue that we had to keep open with our finance office and our other offices, even up to the board of directors, because that transition triggered a very significant move from a CapEx, centric model of purchasing to a very OpEx-centric model of purchasing. And when we looked at platforms like the Salesforces and the ServiceNows of the world, those type of platforms that are really heavily reliant, more departments get on board, and it's highly customizable. So my CFO will come back to me and continue to say, hey, you keep saying this growth isn't going to sprawl beyond the growth rate of the business, but yet we keep seeing another customization initiative, another module being added, another this, the other. So while those things are good, it takes a long time to see that ROI and actually realize it. And by the time we've realized it, you've gone off and started building another module. So talk to me about kind of what that sort of financial modeling transition looked like for you guys.
Yeah, there's definitely pain there because from the CFO's perspective, he's used to sort of the on-prem CapEx model where he's like, look, this is cool, I can depreciate it, it's part of my EBITDA, right? So I get tax benefits associated with the depreciation and the schedules. And he's like, look, you're converting everything to OpEx, and just from a sheer earnings perspective, it's like you're killing me, right? That's the way that conversation goes. But at the same time, for us, it was speed of delivery was a business driver. It was a literal necessity because for all of the last 6 years, the company has grown at 40% top line revenue growth year over year. And that requires the associated increase in customer service reps and operations and compute power and all of those things. And so for us, part of why 2015 was so rough was because literally daily, servers were falling over because you needed one more here, and you needed one more there, and you needed one more over there. And so for us, getting out of the on-prem stack where we were trying to calculate, like, what does this curve look like, and get into Amazon where it's like, all right, you need one more? Great, turn on one more. But that feeds back into that CFO conversation where it's like, yeah, but here's the thing. When we turn on one more, then we pay for one more, right? So it was very challenging for us to try to model what that was going to look like. And especially in the beginning, went through a lot of issues around just looking at, so I guess one of the pitfalls is in Amazon, for those of you who aren't familiar, you have on-demand instances, right? And you have reserved instances. And so for us, it was working through issues of, do we buy this like for the year? Do we buy it for like the next 2 weeks? You know, what do we, is this a seasonal blip, or do we really need it? And so there was a lot of kind of heartache around trying to figure out exactly what we were doing there from a costing perspective.
Yeah. How about?
For me, it actually didn't bring about a significant amount of issues because we didn't have systematic security across the board. And in order to have a proper defense in depth strategy, if you can't get all of your employees to leverage the same security mechanisms systematically across the company, you're going to fail. Someone's going to end up compromising one employee, pivot into the rest of the corporate network, and own Active Directory and then gain access to all of your internal applications. So it's a very common theme that happens across the board. So we had to come up with a strategy to make sure that every employee in the company had the same security requirements and mandates across the board. No exceptions for the developers, no exceptions for the help desk, things of that nature, or various locations across the country. And all I had to do was just do a cost-benefit analysis to compare what it would cost me to go out and acquire, purchase certain type of equipment to provide systematic security across the board for all the employees in the company, as well as comparing to some of the OpEx models and the continuation of what those costs will be. And very quickly saw that you'll have an initial savings right off the beginning compared to a traditional CapEx model because you don't have to go buy equipment out. And with CapEx, it's not like you don't have OpEx expenses. You will still have 20 to 25% of operational expense for renewal, maintenance, things of that nature. And you just compared that cost with what it would be from an OpEx perspective with moving to a SaaS-based security service, and it actually kind of flushed out to be the same. But then speed comes in, such a critical factor. I was able to save a lot of money because physical infrastructure usually had downtime. We had one email security product in the environment, and that particular product would generally have an outage once or twice a month. And it would tax the security team heavily because we were actually operationally responsible for it. And just by migrating to a different product that I don't actually have to allocate resources to manage, at least from a physical infrastructure perspective, really helped morale across the team. And how much do you pay for that? Well, how do you calculate the cost for morale and improving performance and efficiencies on the security team? That becomes a lot more complicated. But again, just the basic cost-benefit analysis, if you take the time to do so, especially if you have to buy equipment, moving to a SaaS model is moving to an OpEx model is not too difficult to justify.
Yeah. I think actually just to jump back into, you made a great point, which is one of the things we didn't consider when we first went to the cloud was when you have on-prem infrastructure, there's a lot of stuff that's running all the time. And you start to think about, like, wait, does this actually need to be on at 3 o'clock in the morning? Wait, it's a development environment. We don't have offshore developers. Everything's done here in the US. We don't actually need this at 3 in the morning. And so you start to develop processes and procedures for literally turning things off for 12, 14 hours a day that you don't need them. And then that helps kind of flatten your cost curve a little bit. I think the other thing from a security perspective that's really important, and you touched on it, is standards. We realized that we needed new standards for cloud security because you're constantly spinning things up and down. And so this classic sort of perimeter-based notion of like, I have a firewall, I have a set of rules, all my assets are known, they're here all the time. It's like that goes out the window because in 3 hours, there might be servers on the network that weren't on the network 3 hours ago. And so you need really, really good standards that you're pushing into your development operations team, you're pushing into your operations team so that they know when something comes on the network, especially in production, this is the baseline image, this is what it has to look like, this is what goes on it. And so from a security tooling perspective, it's really interesting too because you've got assets that literally are kind of coming and going all the time. And so establishing a baseline posture around what security looks like in your network is a very important thing in terms of standards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we definitely went through that too. It's a whole different discipline. So that kind of segues into something else that I want to discuss. So with every organization's journey into the cloud, right, there is that journey from an infrastructure as a service perspective is a very different one from a journey out into like a heavy SaaS-based perspective, and it forces questions of, even if we could host this in an infrastructure as a service model, do we even want to? What is our company's sort of core belief as to in-source versus outsource on that? And what I really wanted to ask is, as you kind of navigate through that, sometimes that's a very deliberate decision, sometimes it's a decision that falls into your lap that you have to start kind of navigating through, but it has impacts on the traditional kind of staffing that you've had internally to kind of support this whole on-prem architecture. How did that play out for you guys? Alex, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, it significantly helped us as we migrated a lot of the security toolings to the cloud, not just the rest of the companies towards the infrastructure. It helped really keep the security team lean, and keeping a technical security staff on board really can help in the automation side of the house as well. So you don't have to necessarily constantly expand the security team. And unless you're a security company, security is not a quote unquote, I would say, something that people wake up in the morning and think about for the company's benefit, generally speaking. We're a bit of an expense. We're a tax. I know that the terminology is generally not liked, but we're a bit of a tax on an organization to ensure that the revenue they're creating is not ultimately lost due to some external, even an internal factor. I think a lot of organizations think hackers as the risk, but based on my prior experience in federal government, generally internal issues are much more problematic. But besides that point, one of the things that need to be addressed in this space, and I completely lost my track of thought. What was the question?
Well, the question was, in your migration to cloud, how did that affect? Did it have any effect on your internal staffing?
Oh yes, that's right. Yes.
It's a different set of skills. And
So yes, so by keeping your staff lightweight and efficient, that's what the cloud does help facilitate. You don't have to have traditional infrastructure teams, and this is a really interesting issue for security, period. And I will have a good amount of back and forth with a lot of my colleagues in this space. If you are going to be making a true cloud transition and really start focusing on fast functionality, non-traditional infrastructure type capabilities that the cloud does provide this day and age, your security team needs to systematically move towards more of an application security mindset than traditional infrastructure and network security models. We had to make that transition. I actually had to get rid of traditional security guys that were on the team, at least as they were transitioning out. I took their positions and started bringing in application security architects, started really focusing on pen testers that were really good at the application level, because that's the maturity model that we'll take as you go to the cloud, especially using containerization, as Nicolas was speaking about earlier, and going into fast-based functionality where you actually don't have traditional infrastructure anymore. Your code really becomes the most critical element that you have to keep secure, and that's where an application security architect and having a security team focusing on application security is going to be a very, very important move for an organization.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. That's because when you're doing, especially you think about Amazon, if you're using Lambdas and other microservices and things like this, it's all about the code because literally everything else is being handled by Amazon. And for us, we were able to keep the team lean as we grew by leveraging aggressively software as a service, not just for the business, but for security as well, right? You start to get out of a mindset of patching, right? Like patching, especially the PCI DSS folks in the room will remember. It's like that's the first thing that your auditor hits you on because he knows you're probably not doing it right, at least somewhere in your enterprise. And the minute there's no servers in the equation, you start to move to a quote-unquote serverless architecture. Well, guess what? There's no more patches, right? So all of the emphasis from a security perspective shifts to, what's the code? What's actually running in the container as opposed to what's running on the server, what's running on the box. We shift away from traditional network sort of mindsets around what are the open ports and are we closing down everything? Are we changing the default passwords to, hey, is there a SQL injection in this code? Like the OWASP top 10 becomes a huge, huge thing in terms of educating not just your folks, but your development teams as well. But definitely for us, we were able to really scale with the organization using and aggressively leveraging software as a service. I think too, there's a notion that when you become more cloud-based, that you're opening yourself up, that you're becoming less secure because you're breaking down the perimeter. good conversations with executives in my company where I told them, I said, no, in some ways, this is counter trend because if you think about Office 365, there are more people in the Office 365 incident response team than there are in my entire product and technology organization, right? Like they literally have more IR people than we have people, period, in product and technology. And so are they doing a better job of IR than I would be doing on my on-prem Exchange server? Like, yeah, for sure they are. And so when you start to think about software as a service in that perspective, you're leveraging, especially for SMEs, which we're sort of in that space, you're getting the benefit of everything smart that Google is doing, that Amazon is doing, that Microsoft is doing.
That's true. You know, I think we saw another transition as well, right? So the staff transition and tooling and capabilities and skill set development you need to move to an infrastructure as a service model, especially there's discussion yesterday about containerization and kind of how you need to address that application security. But in a SaaS model, it's almost a different equation, and not all SaaS providers are the same, right? They are not all as well equipped as Microsoft and Google. One of the things that we also had to contemplate in our whole staff transition model was all the non-technical aspects of the security impacts of the governance that happened as we started moving out to SaaS. We had to actually hire on like a lot of cyber legal FTEs to spend a lot of time on the front end and contracting with the SaaS providers, because it wasn't just here's our third-party security requirements anymore because you're holding our data. There was a whole lot more language and negotiation that had to happen up front to say, how am I going to get my data back? How am I going to get it into a SOC environment? I am now outsourcing something that is some flavor of a crown jewel, and I'm losing visibility here. So while I may trust or may not trust the level of what that SaaS provider is doing, you are going into a bit of an opaqueness. And so it's a leverage game and it's a negotiation game to say, hey, how can I get that back out? So while we actually had to pivot a little bit away from our typical, network security kind of folks, we still have them, but we needed less of them. We needed more folks on kind of the GRC side who were really familiar with these kind of SaaS models, and we needed to reposition our SOC's focus to understand, hey, you're now going to be taking in very disparate, different looking and feeling kind of data streams, and going to be having to figure out how you're going to data onboard that. So did you guys see any of that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the number of sort of net ops, NetSec kind of folks that we had has been relatively static over the last 4 years, whereas we have twice as many GRC people as we did 4 years ago. And it's exactly that. So you think about third-party risk management and, your sort of supply chain risk, which we talked about yesterday, and it becomes a really, really big deal because you find yourself relying a lot on assessments that vendors are doing in terms of, some of them are really great, right? Like, so Amazon, Salesforce are really upfront about like, here's our SOC 2 type 2, and they're giving you a lot of data around their security posture. Other vendors, not so much. And how do you get comfortable in that space, right? And so they're telling you, I can't tell you the number of times I've been in a vendor conversation where somebody said, yeah, we're on Amazon, so we're secure. And I'm like, yeah, I'm on Amazon too, so I know that that's not the whole ballgame. And in fact, if you read Amazon's documentation, they will literally tell you all of the things that are your responsibility. Yeah. They're very explicit about that, which is one of the things I love about them. But you get a lot of vendors, especially new ones, that they're like, yeah, we're on Amazon, so we're secure. And I'm like, no, yeah, there's all this stuff. And so from a GRC perspective, you then have to go back to them and say, look, if you're not covering this, where are you guys? And you wind up in sort of a questionnaire conversation with them where it's like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I've had to say no to vendors in our ecosystem. And of course, that's always a hard conversation with sales, because sales is like, yeah, we already bought it. So no one else in the room's had that experience, right?
But it's going live next week. We already signed it.
Exactly. We already did it. I was like, ooh, yeah. I'm not sure how the rest of our funding ecosystem is going to feel about that, right? So it's definitely, you have to put a lot of additional emphasis on third-party risk management. And for us, it was not just on the security side. On the finance side, which owns our vendor management program, because ultimately they have to write the checks, they had to add an additional person specifically to do just vendor management, vendor onboarding, there was a handoff to us in terms of doing vendor risk assessments. And so, you have to completely rethink, like, what are my definitions of critical suppliers? What makes something critical? Is it the data that they have access to? Is it the role that they play in my supply chain? You have to put definitions around all of that stuff and understanding where all of these companies fit.
Yeah.
To vouch for what Louis was talking about, just share a really funny story. We were working with one SaaS provider, more of a startup, and actually they weren't a startup, they were around for a couple of years at this point. And we had a really good relationship across the board between legal, finance, to ensure that there's a systematic process that we're followed, but this was still a little bit one of the earlier ones. And the salespeople wanted to bring in another product like they usually do, and these guys had sent in their SOC 2 report, and they're like, yeah, these guys are really secure, they're doing everything really, really well. And we spoke with them, they gave us a copy of their report, and they finally forwarded me the material, and all that this vendor did was provide the Amazon SOC 2 to our staff. And our staff, not understanding really what's occurring, ultimately it pushed it all the way up. If I did not really see and get involved with this probably would have gone through. This is just kind of the things that would occur across the organization if you don't have strong collaboration and processes established around onboarding a SaaS provider or any kind of third-party vendor that comes into play. Now, if we're speaking specifically for SaaS, one of the basic requirements that I had to mandate to make sure that a SaaS provider can come in is the ability for them to integrate with our centralized identity access management platform. And if you have a SaaS provider that does not support modern authentication, such as SAML, OpenID, and they require integration to, like, say, Active Directory, which we kind of spoke about earlier, that's not going to be a strong strategy. You probably need to go to more modern authentication, because what you want to do is you want to get to the point from synchronizing your user base across the entire enterprise to access resources is the onboarding, offboarding process. Employees terminated, do they still have routine access to the cloud infrastructure? And I will guarantee you probably have cloud instances across the company that in the event if an employee is terminated, they can log right back into it and get whatever access information they want to. And that's a very, very significant risk. And more of us centralized identity access management tied to your human resources platform, ADP, Workforce Now, I'm not sure exactly what it's called, that comes very, very critical. We actually can terminate an employee and all their access across the company is not eliminated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue into the whole sort of IAM aspect of this, because I think as we've made these transitions out beyond the perimeter that no longer exists, the only fabric that kind of ties all that together is the identities in your organization. And I think that a lot of organizations have kind of gone through a transition over time from having something that looked or felt like an IAM program kind of in its infancy with unclear ownership and unclear sort of bounds as to how broad that program was, to this transition has forced that to be more mature, a little bit more robust, and then security's ownership kind of that, where I think in some organizations that was ambiguous historically. Security's taken much more of a front seat in owning those programs end to end. What have you guys seen and experienced?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So, because it's to your point about onboarding and offboarding, I mean, it's at Greensky we have approximately 40% of our employees are call center folks, and so that's a high turnover space, right? So in essentially 14 months, there'll be a whole new group of people working in that department that have never worked here before. So onboarding and offboarding becomes a really, really big deal. And it's keeping track of all these applications, right? So you start to get this application sprawl. And so you have to understand all of the assets that are out there, all of the places where people have access. And if you're not doing centralized identity and access management, to your point, you're going to miss something, right? Mm-hmm. And so the sales guy leaves and it's like, oops, he still has access to Salesforce, right? These are things that you have to work through in terms of integration, in terms of flow through. It puts HR front and center, I think, in a way that they have not classically been, because really your HR system needs to be the system of record. Yeah. And in some companies, that's been sort of a painful transition for them, because they, obviously people don't get paid if they're not in the payroll system, but the flow through in terms of where does it go from there has often been a highly manual process. And when you move to a highly software as a service kind of infrastructure across your company, you have to solve that problem. And you're much better solving it at the beginning than realizing later through some sort of third-party audit or a Sarbanes-Oxley audit or something. It's like, ooh, we have an offboarding problem, right? So you definitely have to work through that. It's critical.
Yeah.
And again, to kind of go back in terms of the cost savings model, I'll give you some stories. A strong identity access management platform will pay for itself, generally speaking. One, we actually found employees once we actually did proper integration between identity access as well as our employee system of record through HR. We found employees that were still being paid who were no longer with the company. Actually didn't have access to anything.
Why is that bad?
What was that?
Why is that bad?
I don't know. It's a cost savings. So we first year we were ultimately paid for
Not bad for them.
for the cost of bringing in a centralized identity access management platform. Additional cost savings. Again, someone had spoken earlier about speaking the language of business. As a security professional, the two languages of business is speed and money. So I try to really keep my conversations around those two factors and not really try to get too technical with the subject matter. But saving the company money. We identified employees who would leave a company, and because we didn't have integration, modern authentication integration with third-party SaaS services, we were still paying for their subscription on those SaaS services. And that in itself continues to pay for the cost savings there. We can easily calculate as being a significant cost savings for the company. Because as soon as the employee leaves now, access is removed. Their accesses in the cloud, third-party cloud-based services that we also have to pay monthly subscription is automatically eliminated as well, as long as they support modern authentication standards. Again, saving the company a significant amount of money. So again, that's how you justify bringing in some of these technologies, because it also improves efficiency. The identity access, particularly if you're a company that's going through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, generally speaking, historically, what you have to do is you have to open up a network connectivity between the two offices, and that increases risk so much. It's so problematic, and it's a big strategy where we had to come up with the models that we did, because we didn't want to open up network connectivity anymore. We didn't want them to be able to connect and set up 80 domain controllers and trusts between these new offices, because we didn't know anything about the security posture. So forcing them to go over the internet to do the authentication was a significant cost savings from a risk perspective as well. And very quickly we were able to bring in their identity and synchronize their on-prem AD with some of the cloud services we have through identity access management to quickly allow their employees to gain access to various resources the company already had access to. Again, that's speed and then money, both where identity plays a very critical part in an organization.
Yeah, it's interesting, again, along the lines of digital transformation for the organization, where what used to be the infrastructure is now gone, and almost the identity fabric of the organization is the new infrastructure that's binding everything. And so one thing that I've seen a lot of organizations, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but kind of figure out how they want to navigate through it, is managing the growth rate of the IAM program, because that can turn into a boil the ocean thing very quickly. Because once, I know what we went through in our organization was once the broader departments like HR and the other big stakeholders began to understand what an IAM program really was, what it was accountable for, and what it did, we actually had to kind of have the opposite challenge of those business departments beginning to make assumptions that, oh, this is an IAM thing, IAM owns this and is running this end to end, and we would have to say, we're not even yet resourced for all of that, because all of the different applications start popping up out of the woodwork. Once the organization begin to understand, hey, we've got great SSO mechanisms, this makes life easier, this is great, what about this application that I've not wanted to tell anybody that we were using for a long time, but now I want it to be really easy to get to. And we had to go through the balance of, can the IAM program take that on and own it directly right now? Do we have to sit here and say, hey, here are the IAM governance requirements, but this business unit is still going to have some accountability there? Did you guys go through any of that? I mean, Louis?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just from a cost perspective, it absolutely will pay for itself. And the business unit for us that's making that justification is actually our ops team, right? It's that call center team. Because when you move to a full SSO, all of a sudden, like, I'm not measuring, but call center, they're measuring, right? They're doing time and motion studies. So he's like, look, every time somebody has to log in, like, I can calculate what that literally means to the organization in terms of cost savings. And so those guys became the driver of the SSO program for most of the last, like, 2 years, because they're like, wait, we need this app, we need this app, we need this one. We're like, that's like legacy, we have to integrate that. And so now all of a sudden the development organization has now got development work to do, because they have to go out of the old legacy way of doing it, and they actually have to update our internal application to support SAML and single sign-on. And so they absolutely, they took the driver's seat in that conversation, and we had to pump the brakes with them, so to speak, several times to go, yeah, we can't just turn this on for 50 apps tomorrow. That's not a thing that we can do. And part of where that impacts you as well, and I was thinking about the skill set conversation we were having earlier, it also has to change the way you think about threat modeling, because the reality is every single one of these software as a service providers that you integrate into is now part of your attack surface, right? That's now a vector that someone could potentially use to get back into your network, to get to steal a set of credentials, to get access to a set of data. And so you have to, from a third-party risk perspective, you have to think about that in terms of threat modeling as well. So, and for us, there was a definite push-pull in terms of not just vendor management, but also, the whole single sign-on IAM process.
Yeah, we saw that for sure. That was one of the challenges we went through when we were working with our SaaS providers at trying to get data back in for our own SOC monitoring environment. Was not just what can we get, but how do we retrain our whole SOC team to say, hey, you're going to need to look at what abnormal user behavior looks like in an environment that you don't control it, right? How do these users really interact in this application, and how much visibility of that can we actually get to make reasonable decisions as to inappropriate use? Yeah, totally retraining.
One of the significant mechanisms that we're able to help with managing the IAM environment was using one of the functionalities. Is called SCIM provisioning, SCIM. And what you can do is, as an employee is tagged within the HR system to say, this is a salesperson, you automatically can then assign all the applications they're supposed to have access to right off the bat, day one. Very little amount of effort that will be needed to allow them to have those types of accesses, and really giving them the ownership of, if you need to have access to stuff, you can request it, and your approver is your supervisor. That really helped minimize the traditional legacy role that the internal controls team had to do, where they actually had to assign, and people had to request manually access to applications where they had to approve and then go back and forth. And then the auditing that came in from access. We were in the process of setting up policies using the identity management platform that in the event you stop using an application, haven't logged into an application in over 30 days or 90 days, your accesses will automatically be terminated. And that, again, becomes more of a mechanism to control a lot of the risk in this space and really help with managing the audits that will come in, especially for like SOC 2 type elements, to make sure that an employee's access to a certain application or resource isn't being abused or still be needed. We just made it a policy where if you don't use a product, you lose your access. Again, cost savings and improved efficiency within internal controls and the audit teams. And generally speaking, the impact on the employee was negligible because they weren't using the application in the first place.
One of the things we also experienced, and I'm curious if you guys went through this, was, we learned really quickly. Authentication is one thing, authorization is a totally different game. And we found that when the organization began to say, yes, we're accepting the HRIS as the source of truth, that now we've got to navigate through the fact that the roles that are defined in the HRIS do not necessarily match the roles that are defined in the AD environment, or as the roles are built in this particular SaaS application environment. And that took a lot of work just to even kind of get those married up to, we're still kind of chasing that holy grail, I think.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think for us, we seized upon it as an opportunity to build a deeper relationship with our business, because it was an opportunity to go to each of these managers and each of these lines of business to say, okay, I need to understand what you're actually doing with this system, who does it and why they do it. And of course, that all feeds beautifully now into California privacy. If you didn't have to deal with GDPR, so we're in that sort of boat where we're having to get serious now about who has access, why are they doing it, where's the data go. And so It's definitely, it's an ongoing process, and the reality is your business is hopefully evolving, changing, taking on new products, expanding, and that changes people's roles, right? So, one of the challenges we had as well, provisioning is great, but what happens when people change roles, right? And so if you allow the system to sort of automatically do things when somebody moves from one role to another, it's like, was there a transition period? You may want them to literally get the promotion and the title today, but if they're on a 90-day transition, then how does that get managed, right? And so we found places where we had to essentially override the automation because we would get negative effects in the business in terms of what that person's quote-unquote role really was for the next 90 days. But yeah, absolutely.
So, that introduces another interesting topic that I want to pivot a little bit to, which is we're talking a lot about identity, we're talking a lot about authorization, but I've kind of always had this belief that identity is in the eye of the beholder, right? When you're looking at any particular organization and what they are looking at to make a decision based on identity can be a very different thing. And let me expound a little bit. So I feel like today, theoretically, you could take your passport, your driver's license, your social security card, throw them out the window, and there's still like this four-dimensional, immutable digital ID of who you are, what you do, where you go, what you buy, who you shop with, who rang your doorbell. All of this is out there, and it exists, right? And so those things are starting to converge and blur the lines between kind of corporate identity and what that looks and feels like, and personal identity and what that looks and feels like. We're starting to see, that's where we're starting to see applications pop up that people were using sort of in a rogue way, but now they want to use it officially, and they hadn't been using corporate credentials to get to it. So it's introduced a lot of blurriness, and I think that has really challenged us to kind of understand, like, hey, how far do we really want to go with this? I think that as we kind of navigated through that and we began to realize not only is that happening, but there's a rapidly increasing demand for collaboration with external parties, right, that need different flavors of access to different things. The model of saying, hey, we're going to give somebody VPN access is done. That provides really no value. But we start to look and pivot and say, okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that we have to engage with that we don't trust. And so enter the conversation around kind of zero trust models and what those look and feel like, and different organizations' perspectives on that. In talking with a lot of colleagues, I feel like there's the question of, is zero trust modeling at an enterprise scale really, truly 100% achievable? And if so, what does that journey look like? So, Alex, I'll start with you.
It is absolutely achievable. Microsoft and Google are already there. Google's implementation is they call it Beyond Corp, which then took the name of the Zero Trust architectural design across the board. I'm very familiar with why Google actually made the transition. Most of it was based on the Aurora incident that occurred when the Chinese had compromised one of their employees who was working in Hong Kong or specifically within China, and was able to pivot very quickly and easily in the rest of the organization. And they realized, well, I love how Google usually engineers things, because they look at a problem and it's not that they don't directly address a problem in the traditional sense. They look at really at a big picture and how to address it. And what was born out of that instance was their Beyond Corp framework. It's, well, why do we need to have a corporate perimeter? And now you start having these talks and conversations, and the rest of the industry is trying to catch up. You don't really have a corporate perimeter anymore. Your internal applications are now in the cloud. You may have some legacy applications that your employees still access to, and you give them VPN access to that. But when they connect VPN, they don't just connect to that application. They're connected to everything else in the company that they don't need access to. And Google looked at this broad issue, and they realized that as they maintain a traditional corporate network, they're going to get compromised yet again the same exact way. So they started introducing the Beyond Corp framework, which eventually the industry started calling and adopting the zero trust mechanism. And it is very, very efficient. The only mechanism you're able to succeed as a company going forward, if you're going to be expanding out your perimeter and start adopting SaaS services and go to Azure, go to AWS, go to GCP, you're going to have to adopt the zero trust methodology. Another anecdote that when I first joined web.com, the CEO said, hey, I just want to make sure we're running faster than the competition. There's that whole two guys are walking in the woods and a lion pounces on them, and one guy looks over to his buddy and he doesn't see him. He looks down, he sees his buddy tying his shoe, and the guy's like, I just got to run faster than you. And that's kind of that mindset you need to have in a security space. If you're a company that's thinking about, I'm going to secure my perimeter and things of that, it's just not going to happen because it's impossible to secure a perimeter. All the stories we've heard about just the other day with Juan talking about how the Mongols broke through the Great Wall of China, the Trojan horse breaking through the barrier of the city of Troy. Historically, we have been taught lessons over and over again that walls will not keep out aggressors. Yet we continue to have that same exact model over and over again. And it's a lot easier when you don't have a perimeter. All your employees have to go connect to the internet to gain access to resources. And then you start building your security around identity, web proxy gateways, very good solutions. Certificates is a big part of that. And yeah, it can be done. Google has done it. Microsoft's done. Microsoft doesn't even use a traditional Microsoft Server 2019, 2016 servers in their environment. They sell that to you guys, but they don't use that stuff. They know better. It's not secure. They don't use AD in their environment. It'd be crazy to use Active Directory in their environment. But they sell it to their customers. Exchange on-prem, they don't use it, but they sell it to you. It's okay for you guys to have them, but they will never, never, ever consider using it in their environment because it's extremely high risk. Anyways, that's my rant.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. We have to move in a direction of essentially no trust. And we have to think about this boundaryless organization. I mean, as a CISO, one of the things that keeps me up at night is, how many laptops are in my environment, right? And so the reality is, when somebody takes a laptop outside of your company, do you force the laptop to connect back to the VPN every time it turns on so that it's now back part of the sort of home network? And the answer is, I know almost no one who does that. So, we have sales guys, we always like to pick on the sales guys, but it's we have sales guys that they never connect to the VPN because every resource that they need is part of the software as a service set of applications that they use. And so they're just out doing their job, doing their thing, connecting in. They've got email on the cloud, they got Salesforce in the cloud, they have all these apps and they never connect to the VPN. And that introduces other interesting issues because now that's your asset that you have to patch and it never connects to the VPN. So now how are you managing that, right? So now you have to think about how do I take my traditional sort of monitoring and patching infrastructure and move that to assets that are highly mobile, that never connect to the VPN, that are never sort of part of the traditional network. As a security person, it forces you to rethink sort of the way you do all of your security stuff because every endpoint control that you have essentially has to be cloud and SaaS based at that point, or you'll never get telemetry off of it, right? You'll never get the logs. You'll never know what happened with the antivirus on that machine. You'll never know any of those things because it's never going to connect to the VPN. It's never going to phone home. And the reality is if you have all these assets that are wandering around doing whatever it is that they're doing, you've got to go to a zero trust model. You have to think about your organization as being boundaryless in that sense. And we've been talking about third-party risk, right, and suppliers and these sorts of things. They're all sort of in that same boat. So it's if you can break out of the mindset of I know people and I trust people, and you go, yeah, I just don't trust anyone. I don't even trust myself. I don't trust my own laptop, right? If you can get to there, then that makes federating identity across all of these third-party sources much easier because you put everybody in the same boat. It's yeah, I don't trust you, and I don't trust you, and I don't trust any of these folks, even my own people.
Yeah, I think it's interesting pivoting kind of a little bit off of some of those thoughts. It's we're going through all this transformation. It's complex. We got our hands full with it, but fortunately, we have big government and they're here to help, and they're going to introduce new regulations and mandates written by people who are not necessarily technical and have no idea how to operationalize those mandates or if they even make sense, but they also don't care, and you're going to have to do that. And so we ran into really interesting situations where we began to look at things like the right to be forgotten, right? And looking at things like biometric-based authentication that people were using. And we had questions come up to us like, hey, those biometrics, that represents part of my personal ID. It's very difficult for you to justify to me that that is not like a core part of my ID. I want that to be wiped from the system. I want that to be forgotten. And the corporation would say, that's also part of our authentication-based architecture, and we have regulatory requirements that conflict with that right to be forgotten that mandate us to keep that and have auditability over a period of time. And so we're hitting a sort of a convergence of conflicting mandatory regulates that are driving things that are very complicated. And we also ran into, under right to be forgotten, in a massively distributed SaaS-based model, that you can only extend your ability to erase that record so far. And the data is really just in an ecosystem now, so even if a user is to say, I want the right to be forgotten for whatever I've entrusted to you, that has distributed so far through an ecosystem. For us, we're healthcare, right? So your data has come through us to another hospital, to a pharmacy provider, to an insurer. It's not as easy as just pulling all that back and saying, let's pretend it never happened. How has that played out for you guys?
So for us, we didn't have to deal with GDPR, but we're now going through the machinery for California privacy, right?
Oh, you're gonna let? It's awesome. It's fun.
Yeah, it's great. So and we're up against that same question right now, which is so us as a finance company, everything we do is essentially, we don't sell data in any shape, form, or fashion. Everything we do is pursuant to our sort of core business. But the reality is, yeah, we share data with lots of folks. We share your data as a borrower with a lot of people because we share it with the merchant because he's the one who's installing your new kitchen. We share it with the bank because they're the ones who underwrote the loan. And so if somebody comes in and says, yeah, forget me, I don't want to be known anymore. It's like we've got regulatory requirements to save that data, and luckily California has some carve-outs for that, but it puts you in this space where you realize, you're like, man, if someone comes to me with that request, and the law carries with it sort of a duty to notify, right? And so it's not the consumer's job to walk the data chain. It's your job to walk the data chain and go, hey, Salesforce, forget this person. Hey, Microsoft, forget this person. Hey, bank, forget this person. Like, there's a chain of things there. And so part of where identity takes on this really interesting notion is that suddenly we, as security people and compliance folks, have become accountable for literally all of the places that identity exists, not just for our own employees, but for our customers and everything else. And it's challenging. It's hard.
I would say as a consumer, a lot of these regulations coming out are fantastic. As a CISO and being in the business side of the house, it's very, very challenging. Now, I've also had to work in government, and thankfully, I do know that it's a two-pronged approach generally with government making regulations. One part, they make it very vague. So in case they need to hammer somebody, they can find a way to hammer things through. The second part is they don't want to hammer everyone. They're going to probably focus on the really, really big guys and teach them as a lesson, hopefully let it trickle down. You see what's happening with GDPR particularly. It's a big focus on Google and Facebook. And most of the regulations that are coming out is really helping to try to create some level of accountability for some of the really big providers. The California privacy laws that have kind of been pushed through really are focusing on companies that take consumer information and create baselines or do some level of additional analysis on top of it, sell that information. And if you're a company that just goes ahead and gets customer information as part of the traditional level of interaction you have with your customer base, you're not going to be heavily impacted by the California rules. Canada has their own laws that are being pushed through. Sooner or later, the federal government will establish more of a privacy regulation across the United States, because now every single state is establishing their own laws, and that's going to drive businesses crazy, especially with internet-based commerce. It's very, very difficult to go from one state to another and have to adhere to different privacy laws. Sooner or later, the federal government will step into this space and push through some kind of regulation. I don't know if it will mimic Canada's or the European Union's regulatory requirements in this space. I think European Union is a little bit more mandating from a financial loss perspective, so it probably won't be as significant as that. But sooner or later, the U.S. government will have to take action because it's becoming very problematic for businesses, and we're the ones that pretty much bankroll most of the lobbyists anyway. So there'll be an impact sooner or later to make those types of decisions. Overall, though, I found it have been somewhat manageable. It's busy work, not hard work, but it's manageable. And you shouldn't be dusting it underneath the ground, because that's what's going to end up biting you in the event you do have a compromise. And thankfully, a lot of these issues is if you have a compromise. So if you have a good, strong security framework, you generally don't have to experience these issues, with the exception of GDPR, because if someone does want to say, hey, remove my data, you need to have processes in place to manage that.
Well, there's a couple more things that we could jump into, but we got about 12 minutes left. Wanted to give audience time for some Q&A. If anybody's got any questions, we can take them. Malcolm?
Hey, thanks, Joey. Hey, on the comments on threat modeling and software service and cloud and stuff like that, I was wondering how much of your transitions into cloud services you looked at those suppliers as threats, beyond what I'd say the security side of it. If you go back in the day, Amazon hosted Target and their online e-commerce site, and then basically used Target's money to create their online retail environment. So when you think about Amazon and some of these infrastructures of player suppliers, how much of you or your organizations have looked at them as threats to the business and potential competitors to you, because they could upend you? And has the security team thought about that in their threat modeling?
So I would say that we have definitely contemplated that, and I think that that is part of, that for us specifically, that was kind of the maturity curve we went on, where we kind of asked ourselves, are we on a cloud journey, are we not on a cloud journey? Oh, look, we're already completely there. And then how do we sort of from an enterprise realm kind of govern this, and what are the impacts and risks there? So we did actually start asking those specific questions to say, hey, once we're putting this out there, whether it's intellectual property or practice or whatever it is, are we putting ourselves in a position where trying to gain business efficiencies, we're almost giving the business away? I think we're asking that on a case-by-case basis. Now, getting that level of context and business impact to be understood by a SOC analyst is challenging, and then getting them to understand how to data model that so that they can make appropriate inferences and decisions in a perfect world where they could get all the data to do such a thing is even more challenging. And then getting the different SaaS providers to provide that to us in a kind of cohesive way, so that every single time my SOC team doesn't have to go and say like, hey, are there business risks here along those lines? That it's not easy. But yeah, we do it. I think that's one of those things that's like, it's an evergreen process, at least for us. But Jens,
we've definitely modeled it as well, and it's for us. So we have a general sort of concept in our threat modeling where we think about rogue actors, right? And we always include rogue actors at our supplier as part of that equation, right? And so what you're talking about is business risk as well. And so we get into some of those conversations. What's the risk that Amazon is watching us really, really closely and thinking that they want to go into our business? And so it just puts you back in the position to really think about, like, how observable is what I'm doing? How observable is it to them, right? And so it makes you think twice about, hey, do I want to use their key management service, or maybe I should manage my own keys, right? In terms of, and it gets into, from a threat perspective, you also have to think about, I'm trying to think of the term, blind subpoenas, right? Yeah. So someone has actually served up your data and you don't even know that happened. Mm-hmm. And you're like, wait, what? That's a thing? Yes. And so, and of course in this day and age, like, post Stuxnet and all these things, we should all just assume that, post Snowden, the NSA is like in everybody's pocket. We should just assume that. But as a security person, you really need to bake that into your threat model to think about like key management and these sorts of things. Like if one of their people goes rogue and they literally are the network, what does that then give them access to see?
Yeah. That's a really good question, Malcolm. We've kept certain parts of, I would say, core critical business, revenue generating areas out of the cloud. As a hosting provider, going to the cloud was kind of a silly notion to some extent, because we're providing cloud services taken to our consumers from our own data centers. But other parts of the business, which were not the same type of things we were concerned about, those types of risk, were transitioned to the cloud. Particularly some activities you want to quickly set something up to be able to maybe sell it off. The cloud becomes a really good avenue to to help that. You know that's not going to be a long-term strategy for you, but you want to build something, test it out, see if it's viable, and then maybe eventually exit it out by selling it to somebody else. The cloud works really, really well in that function and in that fashion. What I will be interested in architecturally from a concept is this just brings up some notions of maybe having to come up with superior models of distributed cloud utilization so that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I'm not quite sure if any organizations are thinking in that capacity where I want to be in the cloud, I want to use the agile functionality that the cloud provides, but that might not be a good idea to put all in AWS. I might want to splinter out the database functionality, use Google for database. The front end side of the house might be with AWS, and my analytics will be done with Azure. And I haven't thought about that, but it might be something that to be really designing and architecting cloud migration strategies towards.
This is kind of off topic, but you said something about the NSA, and it made me laugh. I saw a post the other day, and it said this woman, she was with her son, and her son says, "Mom, why are you talking so quietly?" And she said, "Well, because I'm afraid the NSA is listening." She said, and then I laughed, and my son laughed, and Alexa laughed.
Exactly. I think just to pile onto what you said about multi-cloud strategies, though, I think that's a place that I think most companies are going to go, especially for really compute-intensive workloads. We've certainly looked at it ourselves for certain analytics things that we do because spot pricing varies wildly between clouds, even between regions within providers. And so there's this notion of like, if I can literally choose, if I have a totally agnostic, we were talking about sort of Kubernetes and containers and those sorts of things. If I have a truly agnostic workload that can run in any of the 3 major cloud providers, and I only need to run it for the next 72 hours, it's like, yeah, eeny, meeny, miny, oh yeah, look, it's only 3 cents an hour over there. Let's do that one. So I think there's some of that as well, and that may lend to your sort of obfuscation strategy. I certainly wouldn't want to be the CISO at Netflix. That's got to keep him up at night, or I don't know, I'm not familiar with them, but that's, certainly Amazon is watching everything they do and trying to mimic that in their own streaming services. So.
As a follow-up to Alex's comment about multi-cloud security type of approach, let's say if you couldn't afford that, and as part of your migration journey to cloud, you need to select one. Would you say there's one AWS versus Google or Azure that provides security as service, and perhaps more the tools needed better than the others? And the analogy I draw is we're a big Google 360 shop, and there's absolutely no way that we would actually move off of the Google platform for that reason, because they have such a strong tools and technologies versus AWS and so forth. So is there such a comparison when it comes to security tools and things, Alex?
Most of the cloud providers pretty much duplicate everything that the other one is doing. I would say from a cost basis perspective, and with everything you will get, you're not going to be able to find a less expensive option than GCP, which is the Google Cloud platform. And I usually do most of my personal reviews and analysis within GCP. Our company has not used GCP, mostly AWS and Azure, because they're mostly aligned with Microsoft for a lot of various things, and there become some elements there from a cost savings approach. But if you're a company that is using G Suite, for example, and as you guys are, your identity access management, so G Suite, I'm not quite sure if most people realize what you really get with that platform. It is quite incredible of the various services you get that they don't really advertise, but they provide you a full-blown identity access management framework so you can support modern authentication. And you can directly tie that mechanism within GCP with very little effort, so that if you want to create applications in the cloud that support modern authentication using your existing identity access management framework, which is built into G Suite, it's quite instantaneous. So if you're already on there, I would say it's a good consideration. But at the same time, talking about this multi-cloud architectural design, you may not want to put all your eggs in one basket. You might want to use Google from an identity management perspective, but your infrastructure may want to reside within Azure or AWS at the same time. But again, a lot of that is going to become a business decision, and knowing business, they want speed and they want financial elements that come into play. I would say for your situation, GCP is probably going to be the best option.
All right, I think we've got time for one more if there's another question.
So I'm interested in kind of three things. One is exit strategy and how you think about that up front and what you put in contracts for an exit strategy with a vendor. The second is incident response, because I think it's really interesting now to have contractual obligations to report to your cloud provider when you've had a breach of credentials that you discover through phishing, et cetera. And the third is overall ecosystem. So when you think about overall supply chain, you may be dealing with 3, 4, or 5 cloud vendors who actually create a solution. So what are you doing with your teams to be able to evaluate, somebody who's using infrastructure as a service and identity as a service and then software as a service somewhere else? Because used to be, you evaluate one company. Now you're evaluating 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, so for sure, I think exit strategy at the onset is part of the planning, and especially when you start to look at like identity infrastructures, right? It is very complex to decouple that in a short period of time. So it does become challenging, and we are kind of always going through the battles of sort of single source of truth versus ability to kind of pivot off of that. We do have a lot more language around exit capabilities and things that could trigger that in a shorter period when we deal with those providers. But the ecosystem gets really deep too. I mean, I remember when we were looking from an incident response perspective at the attack that happened to Dyn, and we were talking to our cyber insurance group and basically saying like, imagine if when Dyn was attacked, and that had impacts on PayPal, and that had impacts on Amazon, and then all the downstream parties that Amazon was hosting, and all of them went down for a period. If all of them had launched claims, that would have been a very interesting thing to observe how that played out from an IR perspective, and who is ultimately ends up being accountable and paying the check for that. So yeah, we think through a lot of it, and I think it's kind of on a case-by-case basis with each provider and with each instance how we're kind of attacking that problem. But guys, I'll give you a chance to close out with it.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's our own company's right to be forgotten, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gone. How do I get assurance that you've actually deleted my data, that all of those things are gone, that we've appropriately exited? And you have to think about that going in. And it's absolutely, it's part of the contract negotiation. It's like if your vendor management person is not your best friend, they need to be, like tomorrow. Like that's your homework. Go home and make that person your best friend.
Nothing to add.
Okay. He doesn't worry about it. All right, I think we're probably pretty good on time, yeah? All right, thanks everybody.